Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
I was in charge to protect my country, my family, against the possible aggressive capitalism system.
What did it mean to train as an officer in the East German Air Force, where technical skill, military discipline and socialist ideology were inseparable? Roland recalls his journey into the East German Air Force, from dreams of flying MiG fighters to the demanding realities of officer training and service with the Mi-8 helicopter. He describes the long days, intensive political instruction and constant expectation that war with NATO could erupt at any moment. Everyday life also depended on friendships, professionalism and the determination to keep complex Soviet-built machines flying. Roland offers a rare first-hand account into one of the Warsaw Pact's most secretive forces, revealing how young East Germans were prepared to defend the GDR and what happened when Gorbachev's reforms and growing unrest began to challenge everything they had been taught. I'm delighted to welcome Roland to our Cold War conversation.
There's one thing I'd like to start with. All the things, timeframes, episodes we are talking about right now, based on my personal memories. It is at least 40 to 50 years way back into the past. Thank you.
And that's completely understood, Roland. I'm going to be asking you questions about things that happened a long time ago, but I'm hoping you'll be able to recall most of it. Where I start with all of my guests is, when and where were you born?
Yes, I was born in July 1963. In Grevesmühlen. It's a very small village, round about 50 kilometers far away from Lübeck, but in the eastern part of Germany.
Who was in your family with you there?
At that time, I'm the eldest of 4 children. So at that point in my family was my mom, my dad. And later on, I got 2 sisters, 1 brother. And my parents lived right there at the family. We only stayed there for roughly 2 years, so I was too small. And then we went to the next part of Germany. The only thing I remember is that it was like a small farm, as my parents told me, but we moved very early from there.
What did your parents do for a living? What did they work as?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. My mother is a trained gardener. She got an apprenticeship right there and walked that way around. But due to the point that I got 2 sisters, 1 brother, she was at home for a very long time. And my father was an official in the GDR youth organizations, the FDJ, and he wasn't at home so much.
Were either of your parents members of the SED?
Yes. So my father, due to his job, at least, he get trained as a farmer, but later swapped over to the job as a official in the youth organization. He was a party member, yes. And my mother, a lot of years later, also joined the SED.
What were their feelings about the government? Were they fans of the SED, or was being a member something that was just necessary for career progression?
Just as I managed, so my father worked for the youth organization. It was exactly the thing he believed in, to do the right things for a very long time. And now he's at the age over 80, and is one point in his life who is still on in his head. My mother, I think, was at the point she just followed her husband. So we moved to different places, but I think, yes, my father did it in the way to be fully at that point. It's necessary to be a party member.
Understood. And did you have any relatives in West Germany?
Yes, we had relatives, but I didn't know that until the wall came down. I never get informed. It was the family of my mother, but we never talked about it. So I never met my grandma, and I don't know if there was any other relatives. My parents never told me that I had some relatives in the western part of Germany.
I guess they kept that a secret because it made life less complicated.
Yeah, it's one point. The other point might be due to the job my father did, that he didn't want to know that there are some relatives in the western part of Germany.
Can you tell me about what your home was like, where you were living after you moved from the small village?
Yes, a few stations, to say it that way, in between. The next step was we went to a town, Rathenow. It's a few kilometers from far away from Potsdam, where my grandparents, the parents of my father, lived in a small house right there. Then a few years later, we swapped over to Potsdam. So there was a block of flats where we lived in. And that was a point where I found my way longer. So in between Rathenow and Potsdam, there was a small village. Let's say a village, 2,000 inhabitants, roughly, Wilhelmshorst, also near Potsdam. And there we lived in a let's say old villa, two-story villa on the top floor. And that was a point where I got my first education and everything.
And can you tell me about your schooling? What was that like?
It was, as I right managed, it was a small, let's say, small school. So there I did my general certificate of secondary education on my 10 classes. The classes were very small, just 10 to 11 people. And you was always in the focus of the teacher. You couldn't hide by such a value. And so, as I managed, I had two sisters, one brother. It was a time that I learned at a very young age to take responsibility for my brother, my sisters, to pick them up, to bring them to school, to take them back from school, to do homeworks and everything. And yeah, it was at that point, small village, small classes, but be responsible for that things to bring them. There were different buildings in that village for different classes. I had to swap them around and keep an eye on them. So that was a point to get the 1 to 10 classes, GC. And after that, I started an apprenticeship. We went to Potsdam, and that was the next step I had to manage, at least.
I just want to understand what your education. So you had the primary education, and then did you have secondary education, or was the apprenticeship part of the secondary education?
Yeah, we have to go back a little bit in the history of education system in the former GDR. You got the chance to do class 1 to 10, so the general certificate, and then you could reach the A level later by doing some things. My point was that I found the way to get an apprenticeship combined with reaching the A level. So the apprenticeship was one part to get a trained worker, and at the same time, it was a period of 3.5 years to reach the A level to get the possibility to go get access to the university.
What was the apprenticeship in? What particular skills were you studying?
Okay, that was one of the points just connected to the things I would like to do later. So it was the point to, how to explain it, in engineering, just a point of mechanical engineering and regulation systems. And so we moved to Potsdam, and nearby was a town, Teltow, and there I got the chance to do my apprenticeship and to specialize for measurement, regulation systems, automation systems at the standard at this time, at the beginning of the 80s. So there was apprenticeship as a to do and to assemble things, electrical things. That was a part, and even additional to reach the A level.
What was your first job after you'd completed your apprenticeship?
So it was a very short period. And I just, after finishing the apprenticeship, I only did it for 1 or 2 months, because then I started my career at the NVA Academy, the former Air Force Academy.
And it's round about this period you meet your wife, I think you told me.
Yes, it was one of the lucky points. By even starting the apprenticeship, my wife was right there in, let's say, that factory we met. We spent a few times and fell in love. To say at the point I met there, and we are now married for more than 42, 40, don't hit me, 43 years. It was a long way for her, but it's one of the lucky points of my life to meet her right there at the point.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's always good to hear about long marriages. Always good to hear. So you've volunteered to serve in the NVA. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. Yes, I did it at that point, and the decision was made in the, let's say, a few years earlier, during that time, at the end of the GCE and starting the apprenticeship. At that point, yes, I volunteered to get the chance to study at the NVA Air Force Academy to become an officer in the Air Force. Yes.
What year was this you started there?
I started my studies right there in 1983.
Did you have an idea of what your role was going to be in the East German Air Force at that point, or did they decide that later in the course of your studies?
It's one of the points who changed my life before I started the studies. So the dream was, like every boy or young man at that age, to fly the jets, to be a pilot, to get the chance to fly big jets and everything. And that was just a dream. And one other point behind was, if you grew up in that system, connected with the dream of flying was the idea to protect your country, your home, everything else. But it doesn't work that way. We can discuss it, or I can explain it right now. Or we can also come a little bit later back to that point. I think it would be necessary to say right now a little bit to explain it. Though that was my dream. I went to the checkups. There was physical checks, psychological, everything they checked. And the answer was right now, at that point, before I started the studies, that there was a small health problem and I couldn't reach the aim to get a pilot. Later, after the wall came down, I learned that they canceled it because I had relatives in the West. They were afraid that a young guy getting the chance to fly a plane would flee to the western part of Germany or somewhere to the world. Yes, that was just the start. The next point they offered me was to become an Air Force engineer, to do the studies as an Air Force engineer. And there I started at August, right after the apprenticeship in August 1983.
What sort of aircraft were you studying on while you were training to be an officer?
So it was a long way. And at that point, we got the chance to get trained on the MiG series right there. I think it was MiG 1721. The MiG-23 was the newest stage of the art at that time. Also, we got trained at some parts of the helicopters, the MiL series, so MiL-2 and Mi-8. And even as a MiG-23 was at that time the Mi-24, let's call it flying tank at that time. So that was the points we get trained, or even we got the basic knowledge and were trained to handle that, because right after the studies should be decided where we started our jobs after that.
How long was it until you graduated as a second lieutenant?
So it is a period of 4 years. It was a very long period and a very long time. And the day, the 29th of August, 83, I will never forget, because I had a wife and also a son at that time, and left home only packed with a bag with some personal belongings inside. My wife and a little son were at home. And I, at that point, didn't know when I get next time the chance to see them. And as I learned a little bit later, it took more than 3 months just to come in contact with them afterwards by starting
Wow.
this.
Wow, that must have been quite tough for you, leaving them, particularly leaving your wife with a young child like that.
Yes, indeed. But as I managed, we are married until now. It was a heavy decision, and we didn't exactly know what it was, but it was my point, dreaming of aeronautics, and we managed it. And She had a long way and a lot of time, even later on, as my daughter was born, to stay and to grow them up. I wasn't at home so much in that times.
Yeah, she gave you a lot of support to live your dreams
Yes,
in aviation.
yes, indeed. Though that was a dream of aviation. It was not basically to become, at her point of view, an officer of the NVA. For me, it was connected by if you have a father who is a functionary in that organization, you grew up at that way. So it was a conclusion and connected at that point.
Understood. Did you have weapons training during that course as well?
Yes, indeed. I think it's like everybody who had to serve in the forces, even the conscripted, there was the Kalashnikov to learn to disassemble it, to reassemble it, to do some shootings. During the studies, on the way to become an officer, the pistole, yes, and later on some anti-tank grenades, but basically Kalashnikov and Makarov. And in addition, the training courses to load and reload the planes and helicopters for the weapon stations to handle these things around, this way around, yes.
So the cannons and rockets on the aircraft that you were maintaining.
Yes. So to load up all the rounds for the cannon or to underneath the fuselage to bring on the equipment which was necessary. Yes, indeed. Yeah.
And being an officer, you must have had quite a lot of ideological focus as well in
Yes.
the training.
Indeed. So it was not saying the main, but a big part of. You got your courses every day. So it was connected not even with physical and psychological things. There was a lot of, at now a point of indoctrination to protect the freedom in the world, to protect your family, your home, and everything else. Yes, indeed. So it's long ago, but I think a third of studies might be the ideological part. Yes, part. I think so.
Wow, that's a big chunk there. So you graduate as a second lieutenant. Where are you first posted to? And what year is that's going to be 87?
87. Yeah, 4 years later, at the August 87. So there was a point in a few 2 months roughly before we get graduated. So the personnel managers, the guys, you had some talks and they decided where you had to go to. And I think that was one point that I already was married, had 2 children at home. So I was posted to the Helicopter Transport Squadron 34. Was located in Brandenburg on the Havel. It's roughly 80 kilometers from Berlin. And at that time, my family, we lived in Potsdam. So it was just a distance of 30 kilometers, 38. And I think this year or 1 year later, we managed it to move from Potsdam to arrange a flat that the family could come and live in Brandenburg, right there. So I had the chance to do my job, and the family was right there. We found a new job for my wife. It was a big steel producing industry, and we found a job for her. So that was the first point. The air transport squadron equipped with Mi-8 helicopters.
And what did your role consist of? What were you actually doing there? And you're an officer, so you're in command of a number of men as well.
So that is one of the things. If you talk with officers of the NVA in the aviation, the system just was on the point to let you start in the Air Force with one aircraft in your personal responsibility. There was a crew of non-commissioned officers, so one for the airframe, one for the weapon systems, engine. So I started, it was called the unit One Chain. One Chain was managed for 4 helicopters. So I started as a young second lieutenant in charge for one Mi-8 helicopter with a crew of NCOs. later on, in a very short period, you grew up and took over the responsibility for 4 helicopters, so was the chief of a chain of helicopters.
Cold War history deserves to be remembered, and by listening to the next few adverts, you help us to do exactly that. Thank you. And what was your daily routine like?
So one thing I had to keep in my mind, it was a 6 days week, a flying routine from Monday to Saturday in 2 or 3 shifts to keep the tasks, to do trainings, to realize air transport missions, some PUC operatings, flight operatings, training missions as I already managed. Though as an officer, you were in charge to train the crews. So there was one saying, a technical flight game. So between the flights, you had to assemble your crew. There was one NCO who was flying with the pilots, the technicians, to assemble them and to train them, to keep their knowledge on, to check the knowledge, to bring them to the new start and to the level and to keep the level. I think that was one of the parts. The next part, out of the crew training, there was a unit I was a leader on in a few months later, which was in charge if you replace main parts of a helicopter, for example, so engines or the main gearbox and everything, in a special maintenance area. Flight parts have lifetimes, flight hours, and data by year. And if you take off or if you replace one engine, there's a lot of stuff to do to bring the plane back to flight, ground runnings, hover checks, basic flights. And that also was part of my responsibility, in addition to be a leader of such a crew, to bring back the planes to fly it after main part changes.
If East Germany had gone to war with NATO, did you have any training around what might happen if your airfield was attacked or anything like that?
Yes, indeed. So it was, just to go back to the studies, that was also part of the education to keep the airfield safe. It was all the part of combat training, to man-to-man fights and everything. And I think once a year, half a year, regularly, you had to polish up this by, let's say, simulated alarm, but you never could know if it is a sharp one or simulated. You had to, your guys with special, non-structural, it was groups which were prepared to handle an attack to the airfield, to chemical weapons, biological weapons. Yes, it was part of the training too. And yes, we were trained, and you had to keep on your knowledge by doing it regularly.
People I spoke to who worked on NATO airfields, same exercises and things like that, just to make sure that everybody knows the job they do in that situation.
Yes, it's to my jobs I later did to checker. And so there should be a routine. You shouldn't think a lot of, you just to get it in your mind and just do it in that way and to keep it on, yes.
Were you able to see your wife more often because they were in the same area as you? Did you go home there each night or not?
Let's go back to the 4 years of study. As I managed at the beginning, 3 months, no. And that was 4 years. And you usually got the chance to go home for a short weekend. So Friday, 12 o'clock to Sunday, 29 at 9 in the evening. And bank holidays, you got 2 weeks to see your family. So it was a very tough time. After being promoted as an officer and be stationed at Brandenburg Air Base, I got the chance. As I managed shift working 60 days a week, but it was a distance I could cover by bicycle. So I wore my uniform and I had to go for 20, 30 minutes through a forest with a shortcut to go to the base. But even at that point, as I started my job in the morning, she didn't exactly know if I would be back or if there were some shifts to go and to fly to somewhere to manage some tasks. So regularly, yes, we see us at least if there was not exercise on Sundays, or depending on the shift. If you do the night shift, I went home and she went to work. Okay, but yes, there was a chance. That was the way how it works at that time.
The people you were commanding, were any of them conscripts or were they also professional?
It was, as I managed a little bit earlier, the guys who were in charge for the helicopters, the airframe specialists, the weapon specialists, avionics, they were sergeants, corporals that way. They were a very small bunch of conscripts, and they were in charge for the guard, for example, on the front, or to do the guarding tasks, or to drive at least a lorry or something else. There was not much of the conscripts, but one of these sergeants, he was at that time, he's now the Lord Mayor of our city, and if we met each other every time, hi Sergeant, hi Captain, nowadays he always calls me Lieutenant. So the guys did it, even not the sergeants, but the guys who decided to serve for 3 years to get better access to the university afterwards. So a lot of corporals with 10, 15-year contracts, some 3 years, but a very small amount of conscript guys, yes.
Because of the complexity of what you were working with, I guess.
Yes.
You don't want to train somebody and then lose them in 6 months or
No,
a year.
that doesn't make any sense, no.
What were your officers like that you were responsible to?
Okay, it's I think like everywhere. You had a big collection. The seniors, the young, let's say, hot ones. That was a proper mix of everything by looking back right now to that time. So the greyback gorillas, which had everything clear in their hands. Officers like my age who grew up and do, the technicians, and also the guys, the deputies of the commander being in charge for political reasons, for example. They studied at the Russian Academy or somewhere else. So you had a good mix of everything, let's say it this way around, to describe it in a short way.
Did you ever have to work with Soviet or any other Warsaw Pact troops?
At my part, exactly, it wasn't the case. But as I managed, I started 87, so 89, the wall came down. There was not a long period to get the chance to manage or to take part on big maneuvers. There was maybe a visit of some Russian officers, but concrete a maneuver, how to check how work the planes, helicopters together, I didn't take part on at the time.
What were your feelings about the way the country was being run at the time? Because this is towards the end of the 80s when things
Yes.
start to stop working as they had done.
Yeah, it was a question. Let's go a little bit back to explain my personal feelings. If you grew up in that system, as I explained already, and if you a study of 4 years, and usually even the areas where the jet planes and everything was stationed was a little bit separated from the, let's say, from the government, from the people all around. So at the beginning, it was just a feeling of having on the top of the government some old man, not wise old men, but some old men which should be replaced in a further time, but not the 100% proper thing to say it had to be right now. There was my wife. She was working at the steel company, and she was putting my nose on that points every time, asking questions. But right now, it was not comfortable for me, but it was good that I had a wife with both feet in the life to put my nose on that points and even to discuss it and to find out later. Yes.
So because she was working in a factory outside of the military, she
Yes.
was telling you how people were really feeling in the country and what they were
Yes.
saying to her.
Yeah, if you are busy with six days a week, you don't spend a lot of time on Sunday to get contact to other ones. But we had 1 year or something else before the wall came down, a small garden outside. So my wife came back, and there on Sunday at your leisure time, you had time to have a beer with your neighbors coming from all parts out there, and to get a, let's say, more clearer picture of what happened right now. You are focused on your job for 6 days a week at least.
How much pressure was there on you to join the SED?
It was, yeah, at that point, to be honest, it was the right conclusion at that time. If you go to study at the Air Force Academy for the GDR, if you want to protect your home country, and if you had in your mind or you get trained on that idea that the Soviet troops are responsible to the deliverance from the Nazi regime and to live in a country which stands at that point for peace, for having a good home for you and your children, and not living in a capitalist state. When you get trained to learn that capitalism leads again to a war, it was not too much pressure. It was a decision which grew up during that times to get a party member. And yes, I got the party member too.
It was a natural choice, particularly with the ideological information you were
Yes.
being fed to do that.
Yes, for sure. It was at that time part of my understanding to, if you do that job, if you have your aims, despite from the aeronautical things, but as I managed, if you have 4 years and a father doing that job before, it was the right conclusion and the right thing to be a party member or to become a party member right there.
Yeah. You must have considered America, Britain, NATO an enemy at that time. Did you ever think that a war would happen? Or did you think it's never going to happen?
Yeah, to be honest, it was part of my job and of the ideology. Yes, it could happen that the aggressive capitalism, not divided in Brits, Americans, France, even other system, what I was in charge to protect my country, my family, against the possible aggressive capitalism system. Yes. Yeah. To be
Okay.
honest, that's it. Yeah.
As I said before, it was towards the end of the 80s that you were serving there. How were you treated by the public in uniform? Was there respect for the uniform then?
So you have to keep in mind that the uniform itself. So every family had a son, a brother, a nephew, an uncle who was a conscripted one. So the government forced everyone to serve for 18 months. So the uniform by its own wasn't a problem at all, because neither, if you was in front of a railway station wearing the uniform, everybody got the idea to help you, to bring you in the short period you got release or time off, to bring you to your family. So basically, it wasn't a problem to wear the uniform. The problem for me was there was a small difference. You could see on my epaulets, on my shoulder, that I'm on the way to study. There was an S for study marked and some barks for the years I left. And that made a difference indeed, because that was a clear sign that you seems to be very close to the ideas of the government. There was a difference in between.
And did you have any instances where people reacted to that?
Yeah, two different. One was the point that a guy stopped the car, just had a closer look and said, okay, you will earn a lot of money. It's your point, and just drove away. The other point was a car stopped and a guy jumped out. He was a commander of a tank. And he said, hey, guy, went in and drove me direct to the front of my home door. So there was different experiences at that time.
Where were you stationed in 1989? Same place. Were you still in Brandenburg?
Yes, I was still stationed in Brandenburg. So at that point, yes, right here. And at that point also, I just kept the idea that I will stay here for, before the wall came down, for a longer period and to grow up right at that airfield.
So you thought the rest of your career was almost going to be in the same place?
Yes, Otherwise, if you want to go once again to higher academies and swap over, but that wasn't my planning. I was satisfied with being reunited with my family. There was no plans to go away for the next years.
When did you first notice that things weren't okay in the GDR?
Yeah, the first signs of unrest, as I already managed, so my wife put my nose in, my neighbors at the small garden we had put the nose in, and also another point, when I go back to that times, we were used to bring our helicopters for a general overhaul to Hungary. So there was a big factory which did it for all the Warsaw Pact guys. And so there was an aeronautical plant in Hungary. And the crews which came back at that time from there went off, and they had on their flight suits a small hidden button with Gorbachev flying as a Superman. So the wind of change swapped over from Hungary, and they came back with other ideas, with some points to discuss. So the discussion started right there with that guys coming back, and the flying Gorbachev Superman was a nice button, but thing to start, and even to start inside your groups of comrades to realize and to open a little bit the mind to discuss at that point, really. Yes. So that was the first signs I noticed.
So within your group, you were discussing
Yes.
the unrest and that things needed to change.
Yes, but to keep that picture clear for my mind, you didn't outside and discuss all the problems, how to change the system, because you had always the guys from the Stasi on your side, even in your units. And you had also guys which didn't want to change. And it was a very, let's say, no, not shy, but slowly starting process, even to check who is worth to discuss it, who can you trust. It was a longer way, but it started at that time, round about that time.
But it sounds like there were some tensions in the NVA between the GDR believers and the non-believers.
Yes, indeed. And there was also, through all the group of ages, there were believers which strongly stood on that point. There's no change need. And the other ones, pilots, technicians, who was on the way to say, if you open your eyes, if you see your families, if you see what happened in our hometown, you couldn't deny that. Yes, there was seriously the point, and even the party, the SED, was on the way to avoid such discussions. There was, if I remember right, there was a saying of one of that functionaries, according to Gorbachev and what he did, that he opened in one of the newspapers. Listen, if your neighbor is on the way to refurbish his flat, you don't have to do it that way around either. So there was serious discussions, yes.
Yeah, I seem to remember it. It was one of the members of the Politburo. I think it was along the lines of, if your neighbor changes their wallpaper, you don't need to change yours.
Exactly.
Something like that.
Yes, exactly the point, yes.
It's time for a short break. These adverts help preserve more extraordinary Cold War stories. Thanks for listening and supporting our work. What did you think was going to happen to the GDR? Did you think there'd be some reforms and some younger people becoming the leaders and it would still stay a communist state?
That's exactly the point we started by just find the point to say, replacing the old age, the geriatric group of men on top of our government, changing several points in our system, and assembling a total new GDR with the basic ideas, keeping the good things like solidarity, each other, healthcare, general education systems, childcare, safe income, worth living, and everything. Yes, that was a basically start to think we can change the head of the government, but keep our own state. Our freedom of travel was one of the things, freedom of speech, but to cancel the complete system, and I wasn't at that point right there.
You wanted to keep the welfare system, the childcare, the protection of jobs, and all of that sort of thing.
We hadn't the chance to compare other systems. That was the system I lived in. And that was one of the points after the wall came down, that guys from the western part of Germany tried to explain to me how I lived. And that it was not even easy going. There was different points of view to the systems.
Can you remember when you first heard that the Berlin Wall had opened?
I can indeed.
You'll have to tune in next week to hear more about Roland's experiences as East Germany implodes and his subsequent service in the Bundeswehr. Special thanks to Vitali Gerber, military historian and curator at the Militärhistorisches Museum der Bundeswehr, for his assistance in arranging this interview. Want to learn more about this episode? Don't miss the extras such as curated videos, photos and other content. Just look for the link in the episode information. Special thanks to the generous efforts of our financial supporters who keep the show on the air. If you'd like to join this select band, go to coldwarconversations.com/donate. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations on Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and see you next week.